Wow, that didn't go the way I planned. Have you ever had occasion to say those words? I suspect most of us have. And for everyone who was involved in the burial of Jesus, they too had occasion to say those words. The friends of Jesus, the enemies of Jesus, they both had plans for the body of Jesus, but things didn't go as they planned. Take, for example, the friends of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, the women who followed from Galilee and stood nearby. They had plans to come back on Sunday morning and finish the burial of Jesus. But the Jewish leaders, they had other plans. The chief priests, the Pharisees, they approached Pilate the very next day. That'll be Saturday. They put in a request to Pilate. You give orders that his grave be made secure until after the third day. In other words, allow no one to enter into that vicinity or into the tomb. That especially means not the disciples. In other words, for the friends of Jesus, their Sunday plans had just been canceled. Now, what was driving this request? The chief priest Pharisees said, Sir, we remember that when Jesus was still alive, he had said that after 3 days I will rise again. Now, it's not that they believed in his claim of resurrection. They just didn't want the disciples to come in by night, steal the body away, and then start that rumor that he's risen from the dead. Now, you can already see in the way they're speaking on this Saturday that their hateful spirit is still there. Even though they tortured Jesus and killed him, they're still bitter. They're still spiteful. They refer to Jesus as that deceiver. And they speak of the last deception would be worse than the first deception. Now, the last deception would be the story of resurrection, that Jesus is alive. The first deception was his claim to be the Messiah when he was not. His claim to be the Son of God when that was blasphemy. You see, what they're doing is once again slandering and maligning the ministry and character of Jesus. Well, Governor Pilate authorized what they asked for, told them you can have a guard and make the tomb as secure as you know how to make it. They will put into effect several security measures. Now, the first thing they'll do is take control of the tomb. I mean, that's the obvious. You got to put a perimeter around the tomb and not allow access to it to anyone. And that would especially apply to the disciples. It's like what happens today when the police will secure a crime scene. Put up the yellow tape, tell everybody to stay back on the other side of the yellow tape. That's what they did in effect. They secured the tomb. They took control. Now, the second thing to do is to put the large stone over the entrance to the tomb. Now, actually, Joseph of Arimathea had already done that on Friday evening. You see, the stone was part of the tomb design. It could be rolled and close the tomb. It could also be rolled away and open up the tomb as was desired. Joseph closed it Friday evening. The women will want someone to open it up on Sunday morning. Now, what the Roman soldiers will do is they'll close it and keep it closed. Now, before they do close it off, they first have to confirm that the body is in the tomb. Sometimes today you'll hear a skeptic say, well, those idiots, they closed the tomb and didn't realize the disciples had already sneaked the body out of there before there were the guards. Now, that would be a rookie mistake, not to first look before you seal the tomb. You see, those are trained Roman soldiers who have been told to keep that body in the tomb and don't let anybody have it. First thing they're going to do is check the tomb. And the Jewish leaders, who are the ones who are wanting this to happen, to make sure that body does not leave the tomb, first thing you do is make sure it's in the tomb. They will inspect the tomb, and then they will put the stone over the entrance. Another security measure would be the posting of the Roman guards. The Roman guards will be there in front of the entrance. They'll be there 24/7. They'll be armed, and they'll rotate in their shifts to make sure that all through the night and all through the day, nobody enters that tomb until after the third day. Now, one more thing that's done is they will put a Roman seal on the stone. Now, the Roman seal that will be attached to the stone is not something that is impenetrable. It's not something that you can't break through. Oh, you can. It's easy to break it. But there are severe penalties for anyone who would break the Roman seal. You do that, you'll be dealing with the power of the law, and it will not be worth the cost. So on this occasion, as they made the tomb as secure as they could, there was no way out. No way that the body of Jesus was leaving that tomb, well, unless something supernatural happened. Speaking of something supernatural, Matthew tells us that on Easter morning, early in the morning, a severe earthquake occurred. God brought that. And an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, came down and rolled away the stone, and then sat upon the stone. Now that angel of the Lord apparently was not too nervous about breaking the Roman seal. He had no fear of the repercussions. He opened up the tomb and allowed then for anyone to come and see that the tomb was empty. Now when the Roman soldiers saw the angel, they were terrified. Matthew says they shook with fear, and they became like dead men. They may have perhaps passed out, or just simply froze in their tracks. Now think about that. These are men who are trained for battle, trained to face an enemy. However, they're not trained to stand off against an angel shining with the light and glory of heaven. Well, what did those Roman soldiers do? They ran back into the walls of Jerusalem and they reported to the chief priests. They told them what had happened, and then that's where a cover story needed to be devised. And so the first order of business was to bribe the soldiers. They gave them a large sum of money. And then they gave them the story to tell. You're to say that the disciples of Jesus came by night. They stole his body while we were asleep. Now that would be a risky story to tell, because there were severe penalties for any soldier who fell asleep during their post. You may recall the story in Acts chapter 16 of the Philippian jailer. Paul and Silas were in prison singing songs at midnight. An earthquake came, all the doors opened up. The jailer assumed that his prisoners had escaped. Now, rather than face the judgment that he would be facing, it says he drew his sword and was ready to kill himself. He'd rather commit suicide than have to face whatever happens to a soldier who was negligent at his post. So the Jewish leaders have asked them, will you tell that story? Now, they had to assure them that if this ever comes to the ear of the governor, we'll deal with Pilate. Don't worry about him. I think if I was a soldier, I'd have worried a little. But they took the money and they told the story, and the rumor spread all through Jerusalem among the Jews. And Matthew says it's even being told to this day. That's when he's writing the Gospel of Matthew. Some 25 or 30 or so years later, people were still telling that story. And you know, even today, skeptics still tell that same story. But I'll tell you about that story. It was implausible. It doesn't really make sense if you look at it closely. If in those days there were any inquisitive minds, like we have today, people who are curious and want to know if something is really true, if they had anyone like our investigative journalist, or just simply people like me and you, who we hear a story on the news say, well, I don't believe that. If they had anybody who could think like that, they could have looked at this story and real quickly seen this thing doesn't make sense. First, it was unlikely that all the soldiers would fall asleep on the same night and the disciples could sneak past them, move the stone, get the body, and them not know. Now keep in mind, they are trained to stay awake and do their job, and they know the penalty if they fail. What are the odds every one of them failed on that night and they went to sleep? Also, if it's true that that happened, how come those guys aren't in prison or executed? You see, that doesn't make sense. And where was the public outrage of the Jewish leaders? I mean, they should have been yelling and screaming in the streets about what Pontius Pilate did, that he couldn't keep the body of Jesus secure. After all, they were there Friday yelling and screaming. Where are they now? And think about this. If the disciples actually stole the body of Jesus and then went around telling everybody a lie, that he was risen from the grave, would they be willing to suffer and die as martyrs for something they knew was a lie? You see, none of this makes sense. It smelled fishy. It stunk to high heaven. I think somebody would have figured it out. You see, the truth of the matter was that the schemes of the Jewish leaders and the power of the Roman soldiers could not hold Jesus in the grave. The plans of mortal men can never stand against the plans of the Almighty God.